Should be.
Hello? Okay, great. Thank you so much for your time today and everyone who stayed till the end. I just wanted to make a few comments before, well, first of all, I want people to introduce themselves. Rachel, have we been on Zoom together?
We have.
We have?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. My brain is fizzled at this point. So good to see you.
Understandable.
Well, why don't you introduce yourself? You're the one we haven't heard
Sure.
from. And tell us what you do.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm Rachel Bronstein. I'm the Director of Policy at Her Justice, which is a New York City-based legal services organization. We serve women living in poverty in family law, divorce, and immigration. And I direct and lead the policy work there, which we can talk about as we go on. Thanks.
I do remember. No, I'm sorry. It just, when I heard your voice, it all came to me. You've heard from all of us. Rachel's joined us today for the rest of the conversation. And when you look at taking action, it made me think about something I did when I was trying to help the men whom I was studying, but also figuring out how could I make sure their lives was a little bit easier. We used to do something. We did something in Milwaukee called Breakfast with Dad, and so I raised $30,000 for the year from a grant that I got. And every Saturday, me and 4 or 5 other men would cook breakfast, and men could bring their children, the mothers of their children, anybody they wanted to. And I also had set up services where there were legal services there was child support there was health care there, as well as some employment agencies who I recruited to help me engage men in a way that they hadn't been thought of in terms of being a parent. And we did that for a year. And so in that particular Saturday, the men would also come, and if they showed up, the state would forgive a good portion of their state-owed debt, because they showed up with their kids and the parents, and then they also would set a date for them to go to court to get their orders modified. And so I thought about that, and I did that 20 years ago. No, yeah. How long have I been a professor? 20 years ago was when I was first starting out as a professor, to try to get the community to see me as a person they could trust for research purposes, but also that I was more than just a researcher. I was someone who really wanted to make sure that people's lives were being transformed in some way, because I knew they had this debt over their head. And the state brought into it because of the way the child support system works. It's an incentive system, and those high arrears doesn't help their incentives. So to get rid of that debt really helped them as well. And if it could also modify some of the other things they had. So that's one thing I did as an initial professor, who I thought about recently. I may try to do something like that again. But I don't know whether or not any of my other panelists have been involved in any kind of taking action steps that they want to share, and then we can go into some other questions.
So for me, I guess I should have maybe introduced myself a little bit. So I'm a law professor. I teach at Seton Hall Law School in New Jersey. I teach everything family law. And the way I became interested sort of in child support, not really sure how it happened, but back in, I guess it was 2004, 2005, I was doing research on disengaged fathers. And one of the things that a real concern was that many fathers, that large percentage of the fathers who were living with their children, who were not living with their children, weren't really involved in their lives. But that research really led me to look at how fathers of color, who were often, in the media, and government, it seemed like, the government believed that these fathers were absent, they were irresponsible. It turns out that they were actually more involved. I really started to look at, how is our child support system actually helping or hurting these families? And so that is how, I sort of got involved in this work, and care a lot about whether our child support system is actually pushing parents, is actually pushing parents away from their children, or making it more difficult for them to be nurturing parents. So that's just a little bit about the kind of work that I've been doing. Yeah.
Richard?
So my journey with parent work started with Young Fathers Initiative that DYCD started some years ago. And one of my programs at Union Settlement was the Young Fathers Program. We had it for 11 years. And one of the issues that we ran into, actually 2 things we ran into that were very strategic and important, was helping young fathers understand how to engage the system, right? Because one, their level of understanding, their level of knowledge about these types of things, but also being young fathers, what that meant to them to have to be pulled into this experience. So we operated based on that issue, based on the issue of developing some kind of positive structure for co-parenting. A lot of them ended up in relationships and ended up having children, and the children were the after effect for a lot of them of a relationship that for them, they didn't really plan to have children in, right? It was like, okay, we got involved with each other and we had a kid, but we're no longer involved together, or we have a bad relationship, or things don't work right. Or on the other side, we do have a relationship, but we weren't ready to have this kid. So navigating, we brought the mothers in, and we would meet with them to try to work on mediation, conflict resolution, partnership, cooperation, because of all the dynamics of the system that have been presented today, right? One of the things was the oppositional dynamic that got built by the system, where the father was like, the mothers is doing this to me. And the mother was like, it's not me. It's not me, it's the system. It's messing with me, and I don't know how to navigate it with you. So those two were very important. The third thing was helping them both develop a healthy parenting orientation. That this too will pass at some point. Where is this going to take you and where is this going to leave you? A lot of times after they go through this journey, their relationships are shot. They have difficult connections with their children. And so part of this was, how do we enable them and empower them to engage a system that is not going to change right now? It's not going to move forward right now. And another part of that was, especially with the young fathers, my core population was African American and Latino. And we would service 100 to 125 fathers a year. And so one of the things that we dealt with is what it means to be a young man of color in the system. And let's have real talks about, how do you deal with that? How do you respond to how people treat you, right? What's your response to the way that people view you, right? But also what it means to be a young father and needing to be developing your sense of self-respect, even though others might not respect you as a young person, right? That you're coming in here at 18, 19 years old, and the way you're dressed, I don't have any respect for. The way you speak, I don't have any respect for. The way you function, I don't have any respect for. And your skin color, I don't have any respect for. But I still have to deal with you anyway, right? So helping them navigate that journey. And then the last piece was resiliency. It was very, very important. You know, whether you like it or not, you have to build the capacity to cope. You have to build stress tolerance, right? You have to be able to have a means by which you handle the pressure and the anxiety that develops through this experience, right? And you have to have a way of shoring yourself up that over time things can improve, though they might not look much better today. And that's not easy. You know, it's a lot of personal development, transformation, discussion. So we would have a lot of groups, individual sessions, parenting sessions, and then workshops. The other side, and I'll leave it with this, is we would go with them when they had to go to the courts and so on. You know, because feeling isolated by yourself and alone is also disempowering. You know, when you feel like you have no support system and nobody really understands. But even if it meant we go there, we wait for you, you go in, do what you have to do, and we meet you and we navigate and we debrief, right? What was this experience like, and so on. The ultimate goal was to help them not begin to slide into trauma responses. Because if that began to happen, we deal with a whole lot of other issues. That make it very difficult for them to even think about pushing in and leaning into the circumstance. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
Yes.
Rachel?
Sure. So I'll just talk about two major initiatives in my work as policy director at Her Justice around taking action. I came to the work at Her Justice as a lawyer with family law expertise, and it's a sort of clarification. Her Justice primarily works with, well, we work with women, people who identify as women, so that means primarily they're custodial parents, they're people raising the child primarily, and seeking child support in the courts. They're primarily, but not only, people who are seeking child support not because of a cash assistance case, although I just want to add a nuance to what we heard earlier, which is that it is very often the case that parents are receiving cash assistance and then not, and then receiving cash assistance and not. So there's a lot more porousness, in my experience, between the sort of the 4D system and the non-4D system in terms of cash cases. Which only makes navigation of these systems that much more complex. So two major pieces of action, I would say, for the topic of this panel. One is that in 2017, we developed a court watch project in the New York City family courts around child support. My experience as a lawyer representing women in child support cases was that the system wasn't working for any parents in court. And we heard a lot of really great information in the last panel about the involvement of parents in court, whether the state is against you or whether you and the other parent are sorting out child support in court, you are in court very frequently. A concern for me was that this was a fairly invisible courtroom. We heard Judge Quinones talk about the openness of his court, but in general, it is rare for people who are not involved in court cases in child support to go into court. So you don't see what's going on. 90% of parents in New York State have no legal representation in child support cases. 90%. There is no right to counsel unless you are a respondent being sued for child support facing incarceration. So there's almost no one has an attorney. So attorneys are not watching, families are not watching, the public is not watching, and watching is an important thing to understand what's going on, to hold systems accountable, et cetera. So we designed and implemented a big court watching project in 2017 through 2019. Had 90 volunteers who we trained to go into the child support courts and observe 800 child support court appearances and look for things like, did people have lawyers? Did people have interpreters as needed? What were their procedural justice indicators? Did people understand what was being said to them? Did the magistrate explain technical terms, et cetera? There's a report that we published in 2021. We think it has shed important light on what's going on in court and the need for more data from the system about who's in the courts. We know it's primarily black and brown people, but do the courts tell us that? That sort of thing. I'm happy to talk more about that. The other thing I would just briefly say is that following on to that, I got very interested in why is there a one-size-fits-all approach to resolving child support in family court? You go through the same set of courthouse doors, regardless of your income type, regardless of your past work history, regardless of lots of things. And so thinking really hard about why is there not a menu of options to resolve disputes? Somebody said earlier, you never see white people in court. I think that's because they can avoid court if they have means to do so, right? You can sit down at a lawyer's table and hammer out an agreement rather than toiling away for 8 hours for a 5-minute appearance in front of the judge in family court. So wrote and introduced legislation with two champions in the state legislature to create a settlement process that doesn't require a judge to help families who are disputing income where parents can agree, as an example of broadening the menu of options in the justice system for resolving child support. So again, I'll stop there, but those are a couple of big things worked on.
Well, thank you. That was very helpful because when you were talking, I was reminded of a study I just did where I looked at 3 counties and I sat in the courtrooms and I observed what was going on. And that the paper is published on UW-Madison's Institute for Research on Poverty. I have a report that's on there, and I'm about to present my findings at a conference in 2 weeks and also in January. And what I found was to get into courts, we had to do a lot to be able to be seen as safe. One, you're safe when you say you're a researcher in one way. But if you're just an advocate to just kind of sit in and watch, because courtrooms are supposed to be, that's what our democracy was built on, that courts are supposed to be open to the public so that someone could be observing if someone's being treated fairly. But child support courts are not. That's one thing that's been very frustrating, that I have to go through a lot of iterations to be able to sit in and see what is said to either parent, so I can document that. To some point where word got out, don't let him in the courts because he's going to document what is being said. But anyway, I've worked my way back in. But it's a really good point, and something that you said, Richard, as well, this whole idea of having advocates for men. It's just not a reality. I always have used the comparison of women who have been survivors. There's a really good group around making sure survivors have an advocate with them to be sure they're treated with fairness and equity, and their voices heard, because they're mostly women. But you don't generally see that with poor men, because again, we have this whole definition of what manhood is supposed to be, and et cetera. So I was glad to hear that. One thing I wanted to mention, and I wanted to bring it up, I'm keep looking at my phone because we had all these questions from our phone call, and Rachel, I apologize. Now I really remember what you were talking about, so I apologize. We were on the Zoom together. Someone mentioned the whole idea of arrears. And for those who don't know, there's something called the Bradley Amendment that came out of ACES, which was the Association for Children for Enforcement of Support out of Ohio, which were a group of white women who were working class women who were not getting their child support orders. And they were very assertive and aggressive and organized to the point where they had a federal policy in 1988 that really started making child support more of an enforcement. Because prior to that, people weren't really doing child support the way the way it was legally statute to do. And so in 1988, it started getting a lot more. And this Bradley Amendment means that if you have an arrears, you can't forgive them. It has to stay there. And so the judge, even though I've been in courtrooms where the woman would say, I don't want it, and the judge would say, well, you don't want to trust him, you don't know. But the women, and particularly black women I've talked to and seen, are always begging, take it off of it's hurting him and these kids. But they don't listen to it. Do you have that experience, Rachel, or have you heard that as well?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of familiarity with that amendment. I will be certainly looking it up. I mean, I will say in our cases, the cases that Her Justice provides individual legal representation on are cases where there is an ability to pay. That doesn't serve the system or individuals at all if we're not doing that, right? So that said, it is in no one's benefit, and certainly least of all the child's, for there to be arrears. And so yeah, I mean, I see that a lot where, we don't want an outsized order, right? The best that I think a lawyer can do in a child support case is present information to the court so that the right order, an affordable child support order, is entered between parents. And I think, sorry, what? There were some things said earlier which I think are really important about sort of how much information and education do people have before they go to court. As was said, I think, by Dr. Haney, the anxiety level in court is so high. I mean, it is for lawyers too, and even if you've practiced for many years, everyone's up here. If we understand what's being asked for us and we have that information to provide, then we'll provide it in court, right, as a parent. And so I think it is safe to say that arrears don't serve anybody, and we don't argue. We don't argue for outsized orders because it doesn't make sense. And we know that the likelihood of paying once there are huge arrears is that much lower.
Do you find in law schools that you're teaching these up-and-coming lawyers, they're interested in family law or poverty law?
Sorry, I keep forgetting that I need this. So I have to say, I have been so surprised by how students are fascinated by family law. So every semester, my class is oversubscribed, and it's not me, because I'm not teaching this year, and we still, the other people who are teaching it, including someone who's teaching it for the first time, her class is oversubscribed. And the reason I think that students are so interested in this is because they're really learning about social justice. And child support, I mean, it just angers them. They are just furious, and a lot of times they don't believe me when I tell them how the system works, because they're like, that just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense, and so that actually gives me hope that our next generation of lawyers is going to be fighting to make sure that our system is a much more equitable system. But the one thing I did want to just sort of come back to when Rachel pointed out, that you're representing individuals in cases where the other parent can pay, is that we, as Lynn pointed out in the previous panel, is that in a sense we really do have two systems. And I think it's really important to make a distinction between cases where parent, the non-custodial parent can pay and is choosing not to. So we've all heard the story of, the chiropractor or the dentist who, is refusing to pay and is enjoying the high life. And those individuals, well, we should be making them pay. Right. But the families that we're talking about here are families where the parents, where everyone is poor, right? The mother, the fathers, everyone is poor. And so what are we accomplishing by now trying to collect money from individuals who can't support themselves? And so I think it's important to always keep that distinction in mind.
So when looking at people who are poor and have limited resources and limited human capital for however we define it, what about the whole idea of the courts? What do you think? What is your thoughts on the courts really accepting something like diapers or childcare? I know when I'm in court, the judge will say, "Well, that's what you're supposed to do. That's a gift." Right. What do you think about that?
Are you asking me?
Anybody?
Well, for me, I wrote an article back in 2006, and the title was "Dead Broke, Not Dead Beat: Redefining Child Support for Poor Fathers," or something like that. I think that was the title. But I proposed way back when that the law should take into account the in-kind contributions that parents, that non-custodial parents, disproportionately fathers, are making. But as we saw, that has gone nowhere. As an academic, I get to make these proposals, and no one has to adopt them. But is it do parents have a moral responsibility to provide those things for their children? Of course, absolutely. But if that is what a parent, and again, very gendered, if that is what these fathers can do, they are doing as much as they can for their children, then shouldn't we be taking that into account? Right. And I really think it's problematic how we have this system between, sort of matrimonial versus non-matrimonial. So as Judge Quinones pointed out, if you're married, now the judge does have discretion to take certain contributions into account. But when parents are not married and you're here just in child support court, you're in family court, the judge has no discretion. It seems like we're making some distinctions based on marriage alone. And that, given that that people of color are significantly less likely to be married when they have children, those, having two different systems is going to have a disparate impact on families of color.
Yes. Rachel, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, as we're talking, I'm thinking absolutely in-kind or non-financial contributions should be recognized. I also think our law, as Judge Quinones said, our laws are so staid. This child support law has been on the books since 1989. I almost think that a family where that is the conversation, that other parent is providing childcare, diapers, whatever the in-kind contribution is, that family shouldn't be doing that in court. Like, that's not the right place for that sort of, I'm going to call it a mediation, although I don't actually mean, that process shouldn't be a court process because the law doesn't recognize it, and maybe it should, but it doesn't. So again, to this point about like where are we solving these problems for families, and how in many ways the law is inadequate to do it well.
Mm-hmm. Richard, you work with young men. What have they said about this whole idea of accounting for things that they do that are not necessarily cash?
So the thing I think that is important for us to think about is the paradigms that drive the systems, right? And the paradigm of support as dollars is a paradigm that is embedded in not only the way that our country functions, but within the context of a capitalist framework, right? From the perspective of how we view what it means to be productive, what it means to be achieving. We frame that in categories of economic development oftentimes, right? And someone could be very financially successful and we could ignore all the craziness of their character.
Right.
And that is, again, because of the paradigms that drive the way that we frame systems, success, and so on. And so part of this is figuring out how do we challenge the paradigm that support is only financial. That's the deeper journey, right? Getting there is really difficult because the systems are so embedded that you have to stop the machine to change the paradigm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You know, and so we got to keep the machine moving. And so reorientation is not easy, right? Redirection of intention and purpose is not easy. So when it comes to the parents, part of this is, especially young parents, helping them to work on their economic development, right? So that when it looks like I'm being criticized and judged by these systems and these individuals, I have something to show as it relates to economic development. I'm on a track, I'm on a path of economic development. So that, I'm gonna use a very, very humanistic word, so that there's some mercy here, right? And it's very little of that oftentimes. You know, I have to applaud the child support work here in New York. Some time ago, they had a panel together, not a panel, they're actually an advisory team, working on how we get young parents more involved in the system and what are the mediational steps that need to be taken to get parenting more functional. Those strategies help us to navigate the journey that you're talking about, right? Because it enables individuals in the system to become indirect advocates of the processes we're fighting for, right? We can literally say we work with the office of that's trying to work with us on how to engage young parents in the system in a more functional way. And that opens doors of conversation that simply trying to advocate for an individual parent may not.
Yeah. You know, the one thing you're making me think about is, like, how do we each take action? So I mentioned earlier in my talk, when I saw there was a bastard court, I said, what can I do to change this?
Right.
And I said, I need a lawyer. And a lawyer can do a class action on behalf of those. And I think that's something I never thought I would be able to. I never thought of myself as a person who would do that. One, again, I have to give credit to my wife. She's a lawyer, so she said, well, that's what you need to do. But it's also, it made me understand how I need to be always thinking about the legal side of this, because this is a court action.
Yes.
It's not something that is just, I can go in and say, no, the policy says that this is a court action. And so it really does show that we all have the power.
Right.
You know, like you're saying, at least is what I'm hearing, we all have the power to make a difference. We have to recognize it. Because I do think sometimes when I go in these offices and I hear them talk to women who are applying for TANF, and they're asking them about their sexual behavior, and they're asking them about how many times has he been over there, or has he been over there, or what do you do with your money? It's like, okay, what are we doing here? Like, why do poor women or women who are just generally as women going in for TANF not given due respect, and we have to know all this intimate detail about their lives? But and someone had said earlier, because it's the taxpayer, and I get that, but the taxpayer is colorblind here, to me, and all the order thinking about someone who has means, and also the fact that we live in a country, and I don't mean I should shut up because it's not just about me. The whole idea of meritocracy is a myth for so many people. I remember people working. My mother worked at Woolworths, and that's how old I am. And she worked in a restaurant, and she was a hard worker, but she never really had enough money to take care of us, so we had to use AFDC benefits and food stamps to take care of ourselves. And I think that we all buy into it because that's how we're socialized, that if you work hard, you'll be successful. That is very true if the opportunity comes and you are there at the right time with the right resources to move forward.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
I think it's important also for us to be mindful of the fact that systems are self-reinforcing. And when systems are self-reinforcing, you have to look at what are the benefit realities to that system's existence, right? Not just for the people or the individuals it should serve, but for its own self, right? And for the larger systems it's a part of. And so economics is very beneficial, right? Trickles of money coming into the system, very beneficial. You know, there was a comment made about this percentage never gets to the parents, never gets to the family, never gets. When you think about that, right? These are mutually reinforcing processes. And the unfortunate side is that we as human beings oftentimes become a part of the reinforcing process by how we think, function, and behave when it comes to people, right? The other thing I'll say is systems don't change easily because they are self-reinforcing, right? We begin to develop ways to keep the system going instead of saying ways to change the system and improve it. And often we would rather see it consist than see it improve. Right, because something is better than nothing. Does that make sense? It's not too good, but it's real.
And just a quick one on that. It was addressed in the last panel, I guess. How does New York match up to other states? I mean, one reason, in my view, why it is so hard to make change in New York, because our child support system is split between the courts and the administrative agency, unlike some other states where there's a more heavy administrative handling of child support. And that makes it really difficult unless those two systems are very smoothly talking to one another, and it's not for lack of will among the folks here who work in child support or otherwise. But unless those two parts of the system are talking to each other, what you get is what we heard on the parents panel, where it's the individual who is navigating this office. Oh, I got a letter, I have to go back. Then I have to go to court. That's who then does the navigating instead of the systems doing the connecting. And New York has it bad. I mean, I just have to say, it's hard to make change here because of that.
And one of the things that was said earlier, too, like what are other states doing around incarceration in particular? Minnesota has a policy that if you're incarcerated, your child support order stops automatically. And I've always been very impressed by the fact that they know that that's an economic security issue when you leave. So that's an example of something that's going on, at least in another state. One of the things that people bring up always is prevention. So how do we possibly prevent some of this interaction with the system? Some people say to me, angrily, well, they shouldn't have had kids anyway if they couldn't afford them. I hear that often to people when they say you're a sympathetic person. Well, it's not that. I'm trying. What do you think about that? Anybody?
Well, I will say that a judge in New York actually said that to my client back in, I don't know, it may have been 2006, 2007, and said to him, he should not have had any more children. Okay, so that is the perception still of some judges. And by the way, the reason, if you're thinking, wait a minute, there was a father in a child support case who had a lawyer. It was my cousin. I was representing a family member, free, pro bono. But in terms of prevention, we're not going to stop people from having children. I mean, that's it is, they're going to have children. But what can we do to prevent, sort of the injustices of the system? I go back to access to justice. The fact that parents are not represented in these cases. I mean, anyone who has tried to read these statutes, I mean, I have my students who are reading it and they struggle with it. They really struggle understanding it, and they're law students. So we need to have a system in which people are represented. That would make a huge difference. And, I mean, you said, obviously, David, that you were involved in the Turner case. Well, we know that, that individuals, once they have a lawyer who will provide the documentation that a judge needs to make the decision as to what the child support award should be, or whether you qualify for a poverty order. Well, then that really takes care of a significant part of the problem. But thing is, if you're not represented, you go in there and you have no idea that what you're supposed to bring. You don't know that the onus is on you to show to the court that you cannot afford this amount. And so that is how people end up with, with these orders that they cannot pay, don't know that they're supposed to modify it. So it just goes back to, I think, access to justice. We need to make sure that people are represented in all of these cases.
Yeah, and just to add to that and information that is accessible, even before you go to court, right? We said that before, but that form that requests your financial information, is it easy to read? Is it 20 items long? Do half of the things on here, I don't even know what they are. So is the information, right? I mean, if you think about like going to the doctor, I mean, we could make the same arguments about access to healthcare. Do you understand what's being said in your medical chart, right? So it's the same, it's information, it's legal representation where needed. And I also, just to make the point again, a menu of options as to how we resolve conflicts in this area or how we get child support delivered to children, because not all families need to be in litigation. Right? Not all families need to be in an adversarial back and forth. Many do not. Many do not want that. So some individual choice and agency coupled with all of these other things is really agreeing what we're talking about.
The system is so vested in personal responsibility, So how do we get over that? I mean, I hear what you're saying, but there's this push of personal responsibility. What do you think of that? Like, it's a hard one.
You made a comment earlier that resonates with me for a lot of reasons. The comment was, is this the context for this, right? Should certain things be happening within the context of the legal system? And part of the reason why that's important is it demands that we think about what is the purpose of this, right? In other words, sometimes we're trying to get more out of something that it should be designed to give us. And we need to think about, like, where should these resources and efforts be placed in terms of prevention, in terms of empowerment, in terms of advocacy. I give an example. It got to a point where we had to say, I'm going to contact my people at HRA, I'm going to contact my people at Legal Aid for them to come and do monthly and weekly workshops with my young fathers throughout the year. Not once, but throughout the year, to teach them how to navigate the system, to teach them what that journey is like. Right? Because we realized that empowerment had to happen before they got there. Right? That it couldn't happen after the fact, because now they have to navigate, and it's that much more difficult, right? So part of this is creating change within the social systems that are designed to help people to function better. But for me, the other side, not being an attorney, not being a lawyer, not being a part of that world, okay, love what y'all do. But we need y'all as advocates. We need the ones that are in the system that are able to say, this is where we think we can really make a difference, right? And that means there's a short-term goal orientation and a long-term goal orientation, right? What are the immediate changes that can have benefits that then can be put on the table as genuine outcomes, right? Because systems change does not always happen without evidence, right? People want facts. And so sometimes we have to look at what are the short-term changes that can be enacted that then we can say, look, this is a pilot. We took a step. Okay, this gave us these results. What can we do now to move this to another level? And that opens doors other than a hypothesis or a concept, right? And some people are not bleeding hearts. You could talk all you want, cry all you want. They are not moved, right? It is what it is. But when you show them these results and they see numbers and they see, okay, now we have a different kind of argument.
So leaning in, we have a few minutes left, but leaning into the education of having to know how to navigate the system, how to behave when you're in the system, to know what you've signed up for. So I'll give an example. When I was observing courts in Wisconsin in these 3 counties, the one thing that was really surprising to me is that people were coming to court, the mother and father, they didn't know why they were there, and it's because they had got child care, and the child care was through TANF. And they said, why are we here? We're living together, we're doing fine. They said, because you got child care. And our legislators said we have to have a child support order in place because it's $10 that are being used, which is a work requirement program. And so and I saw arguments actually occur in the courtroom because the father said, why didn't you tell me this was going to happen? I thought we were good together. And she said, I didn't know. And the judges are sitting there with a smile. Not all judges, no offense to honor here, but that judge was sitting. I remember this judge in particular just sitting there with a smirk on their face, like you should know. What are you signing up for? Right. But if you see those forms, they just sign them because they got this benefit, and it's for the betterment of the child, it's to help you go to work. Right. Yes. And I just think this whole idea of an education is so necessary, based on what I'm hearing. And I do really see a need to have more lawyers or law school students really engaged in poverty. I know they can't make a lot of money with that, but they might can do some pro bono work in the firms they're in. It makes them look good. But I've also saw in that space where lawyers who were representing some of these people who were predominantly white in this, when I would see a lawyer at all, didn't even understand what they were there for. They just thought it was. They didn't understand the poverty part of it. They understood the family law part of it. They didn't understand this is a requirement by the state, by the federal government. Blah, blah, blah. So I don't know where we go with that, but I just think that it's such a complex and challenging issue, which makes it such a racist or a structurally racist system, because you have to, I know it very well because I study it almost every other day, and I observe it all the time. But it took me 25 years or more to look at it that way. And not everybody has that. Any immediate thoughts around what would be the most things for people to know when they go into court? That you can think of, one thing in particular or two things?
Good question.
Well, I mean, I think it's important for people to know that, I think it was Hassan who said earlier that basically the presumption is that you can pay. It's sort of interesting because I'm trying to think of other sort of legal proceedings where the presumption is against the respondent, where you're the one who has to prove that you cannot pay. The presumption is that you can pay. And so that is, so I think that's really important for people to know that the onus is going to be on you to prove that you cannot pay this amount, and so that you have to be ready to carry that burden. I think that's really that would be the one thing that I think everyone needs to. And that
if you can pay now and the order is appropriate, if you then later cannot pay because of a job change, the onus is on you to come back, right? That's a big deal.
Yes.
So, that's a big deal.
So many of the cases involving arrears that I have seen involve individuals who they may have voluntarily agreed, okay, I will pay this. The parents, this is fine, and then something happened. They lost their job, they were injured, and then now they can't pay what they had agreed to pay, which now is an order of the court. But they had no idea. I've said to clients, why didn't you file a petition for modification? And when I asked the question, I realized how stupid that question is, because the answer is, I didn't know. I was supposed to file a petition for modification. So,
and I think what's important about what both of you are saying is that there is a legal process education that must be built into this. Because the terms y'all are using, no, just being real, right? The terms you're using, some people, so there's a need for this in a very real way.
Well, I want to thank the panel, and I think we may have questions, but I thank the panel. Yes. And we have questions.
We have a lot of questions. Very good. I really appreciate everyone using the Mentimeter. And I think the first one I want to ask is a really good one. What do you think is the most important step to address structural racism in the child support program? What is the most important step?
You gonna be a part of this too?
I'm the moderator.
Well, I don't know if it's the most important step, but a very important step, I think, is I would like our New York State Court administration to share more data about who's in the family courts on child support, and not everything else, but since we're talking about child support. I think it is not only hard to, if you're a participant in that system, as a litigant, a parent, a lawyer, it's not only hard to know, for example, how quickly cases are moving if the system isn't telling you at an aggregate level, the likely wait time is 6 months for your next court appearance. It is also important to address structural racism. Who is using the courts? I don't know if folks are familiar with a report that came out 2 years ago now that was commissioned by the New York State Chief Judge, authored by Secretary Jay Johnson, around racism in the New York courts. And even in that report, there are some very, very important points about racism. But even in that report, there's no data about who is using, demographics, who is using the courts, which I think is really important to show transparency of the system, show the potential for accountability, again, navigability of the system. So it is a thing that I think that we should demand from our court system along the way to addressing this issue.
So can I would say that I go back to access to justice. So, for example, I do a lot of work. It's sort of in the child welfare, child abuse, neglect, termination of parental rights. In New York, as in the vast majority of states, you have a right to a lawyer in those types of cases. So when the state is trying to take your children away, you have a right to legal representation. Well, when the state is pursuing you for child support arrears, and there's a potential, not in New York for incarceration, but suspension of your driver's license and other sort of adverse consequences, that you should have a right to legal representation in those cases. And the second thing I would say is we need to stop making this distinction between matrimonial cases and and purely child support cases, because disproportionately the people who have child support cases alone are going to be people of color, where there's very little discretion for the judge, versus matrimonial cases where the judges can actually have equitable powers.
Yeah. Also, for the Turner v. Rogers case, that was one of the things that but the lawyers asked for was representation when there's a threat of incarceration. The Supreme Court said no because it wasn't equal protection for the mother. Right. She didn't necessarily going to have a lawyer, so they struck that down. But they did say ability to pay should be set up in every state, in every child support court case, that they should look at true ability to pay. Yeah. Did you want to say something, Rachel?
No.
Okay. No. Next. Any other questions?
Absolutely. What can be created to support folks interfacing the daunting challenges of child support?
What was that again?
Sorry, too quick to turn off my mic. It's like live Zoom. What can be created to support folks interfacing the daunting challenges of child support?
What could be done to help parents face the daunting issues of child support?
Yeah.
I mean, I think education would help. The fact that, women who generally do have custody of the children are seeking, and they're poor, at least with the women I talk to, are poor. They're looking for some way to maintain the well-being financially of their children, particularly if the father doesn't have much money or it's not there. But often the mother doesn't know that she's cooperating, and some of that money in some given states is going to be going back to the state. When I did my dissertation was on that discussion with men over 2 years. Do you understand how this system works? And no one understood. Like every man I talked to did not know that she had no choice. This is the way the system works. That she had to turn your name in, and they were, and some of those men were very engaged, and some of those men were so engaged, but they were engaged in various ways based on their resources they had available to them. But I think education would be a big issue. That it's a very complicated and challenging system to understand. And some of us have the privilege to be able to study it and to talk about it, but there's still so few scholars who do that, and we only look at it through the lens of, can he pay more? Not through the lens, is this really helping the child to be better off? Is their well-being much more improved through this forced system that people are required to participate in that has some, unfortunately, harsh consequences, like destroying your credit rating and taking your driver's license and putting you in jail, and taking, in Wisconsin, taking your fishing and deer hunting license. I just don't get it. And one time I studied the Native American populations in Wisconsin, and their core systems are so different around child support, where you can negotiate, I'll kill 2 deer for the winter and give you all the meat for you to be able to feed our children, and that's fine. Or I'll figure out how you can do childcare, and that's the way we'll do it. Now, this is only 2 or 3 tribes within Wisconsin that I was able to get this information from, but they do it in a way where the focus is on how is this child going to be better off in this family versus how much money am I going to collect from this man who is identified as the father. So I didn't mean to take the whole time to talk. Do you guys have anything to add?
That's good. That's good.
So anyway, that's what I see. It's just people just don't understand what's going on. And in the center that I ran for 20-some years, we made these things called Q&As for parents in a given state. And I had 3 lawyers who worked for me and an anthropologist, and we would investigate all of the rules and regs within that system. We would do focus groups in that state. And then we would, the Ford Foundation, as well as Charles Stewart Mott, and I think MacArthur, paid for me to give states that were interested in this these brochures that they could hand out in their child support offices. So questions we learned from the focus groups with the men were questions that we were able to answer through a legal, non-legal eye for them to be able to just read if they, and we tried to make sure they were at 4th and 5th grade reading level. Yeah. So it was very simple. Now one state, which was Texas, gave us like a contract to make 100,000 of them. And just on that state of Texas, even though it's, cities and counties can be very different, we try to make it as generalized as possible. But that's one thing we try to do. I don't know. Hopefully, it helped some of those parents. But it was one of our more popular items that we produced as an institute.
Right.
So.
Right.
Well, also you spoke to a comment that someone had about using some of the tribal structures that exist around in-kind support. You covered beautifully, so I don't have to bring that up. But I think another one, and this you spoke to some degree, but I think that there's a deeper question here about how can the program be successful in engaging parents outside of court to get that education of the process, right? What can the program really do to make that, to strengthen that educational process,
Can I?
Rachel.
So something jumped out to me. I think on Kinsey's slides before, I guess it was. I hope I got this correct. That the never public assistance caseload, there's 47% of the caseload, right? So that's a huge group. That's almost half the caseload, never public assistance. So those people, if I'm right, I'm looking at Fran and Beth, are coming into the program not through cash assistance. So that to me says services, right? And I know we've worked in partnership together for so many years now. We've talked so much about the services that the program, OCSS, offers New Yorkers. We've talked a lot today, importantly, about the enforcement arm, right? What leads to debt or arrears accruing and so forth. I mean, this is really oversimplistic because I'm no expert on this, but to me, it's if the whole pie of the program's resources, if we're advocating for less on the enforcement, is there more for services? I mean, I know that there's such an appetite to reach out more to parents in a cash assistance. We're in court now pursuing. So that just struck me. Wow, almost half the caseload. There's like a real services angle here. Yeah. And I know you're doing it, but I just wonder if that lever can be pressed on more if some of the enforcement stuff goes down. Simple. I don't know.
Is there anybody else?
I just wanted to say we need to have, if it's going to be effective, we have to take into consideration the stigma. Let me use a different term. We have to take into consideration that the community does not trust.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It does not trust these systems and individuals that work for these systems. And because of that, we have to have bridging organizations that are able to be the safe spaces, the trust spaces that these individuals, these organizations, the government organizations partner with, right? So that the community can say, well, if so-and-so says this good, I'll be there.
Right.
Right? The other side of this is we're talking about things that can often be embarrassing to say you don't know. Right? It sounds funny, right, to some people, but it can be very embarrassing to say, I don't know how to be a functional parent yet. You know, there's a lot I need to learn. And when the system treats you like you don't know what you're doing, it reinforces all of those things. And so when we have programs and organizations that are able to meet in that space, they're able to validate what the parents' strengths, a strengths model, what the parents are good at, what they're here for, what their investment is, and they feel well supported, right? And that enables us to bring resources into them, challenge the systems so that they can give the resources to support that process.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank all of you again. Thank you.